Hi, my name is Patrick Miller, and I'm here to present the Fundamentals of Utility Cybersecurity. So I was hoping to make it there in person, but unfortunately I can't, so we're going to go with a recorded component instead. I'm actually going to be out of the country for this, but my contact information is on the bottom of the screen. It's at the end. If you have any questions, you can certainly ask me questions via email or any other path, but you're in good hands with the folks at the conference. So introduction, who am I and why should you listen to me? I am former utility staff. I do come from originally telecom. I've worked in water, and I've also done a lot of other municipal stuff, but also done a long history in electricity. So like since 97, actually, been in electricity. I was the first NERC SIP auditor in the country, was the manager of audits and investigations for the Western region under WEC. And they had the first NERC SIP program, and I was basically their first auditor. I did help actually write the original version 1 standards way back before it was even a standard. We worked on the things called what was known as the FERC SMD Appendix G, for those that remember these old days. Also, long history in electric sector stuff, principal investigator for DOE project. I'm also the founder of EnergySec and still on the board of directors. CCI coordinator, which is an industrial cybersecurity center based in Madrid, Spain. And then, of course, I'm on various other projects with NARUC, NASIO, and a lot of certificates after my name. So we're talking about municipal security. And really, I like to look at the small to medium-sized municipalities as kind of what I call the horseshoe nail. And this means really it's the story of, if you lose the nail in the horseshoe, then you lose the horseshoe, which means you could lose the horse, which means you could lose basically the soldier, and then eventually could lose the battle. It's kind of that cascading effect of smaller problems. So it doesn't mean that you're insignificant. What it means is that you do play a key part, even though you're small. It definitely doesn't mean you're a lower probability target, and the statistics behind that are there on the screen. The reality is you are often seen as, frankly, just underfunded and under-resourced, which in some cases you are. That lets attackers know that you might be an easier target. So, as you can see the stats, 43% of cyber attacks are aimed at small companies. Only 14% of them are prepared to defend themselves. And then, of course, 50 to 70% of them, all ransomware attacks are directed at those small companies. So these are stats from Gartner and IBM and Accenture. But the main point is what we're concerned about primarily in the electric sector space is that we're all connected. So you are often seen as a launch point for larger targets, right? So the connectivity that you've got with your neighbors, your upstream partners and neighboring partners, and then of course, any trust relationships that may exist because of that. So what actually works for the small to medium utilities? And I've seen a lot as an actual utility employee, a contractor, consultant, ex-Fed. And I can tell you, there's really, as long as you get at least what I call the top 10, if you can do the top 10, there's a very strong chance that you can knock out at least 80% of your risk, if not more. And this isn't an elaborate structure. This isn't something that's difficult. I'm going to give it to you really in kind of a fundamentals kind of perspective. So this is stuff that you can do. This is stuff that's not expensive. So we'll start with the fact that there are so many security products out there that even if you went out and bought them all, it wouldn't help because there's so much that comes with them. Do they integrate well? Are you trained on how to use them? Did you configure it right? Do they compete with each other? Did the new security product actually introduce a vulnerability? So these are things to think about. We'll talk about a lot of this as we go through these, what I call the top 10. Other things like frameworks. There are so many frameworks. Do you want to follow NIST? Do you want to follow NERC SIP? Do you want to follow IEC 62443? Is it the cybersecurity framework? What do you do? But what works in the real world, in your municipal world? Like what actually has proven itself to work? Not some, security theory or, 10 consultants giving you 20 different answers. What I've seen over all of my different roles and experience, and I picked kind of the top 10 because it's scientifically proven, right? The ITPI, which is the Information Technology Process Institute, and various academic studies have pulled these together in addition to what is known as kind of operationally proven. So I pulled this list together out of things like Visible Ops, ITIL, DHS, ICS CERT, top response mechanisms. So this is something that I've kind of pulled together from various resources on what has actual proof, right? What has shown itself to work. And the good thing is you don't have to do all this at once, right? Well, I'm going to talk about how you can phase some of these things in so you're not going to have to drop everything and do all this stuff immediately. So number one, let's just get right to it. The asset inventory. You hear this a lot and it's daunting because it seems like a big task, and it is. It is if you do it for everything, but you don't have to do that, right? If you could just get the asset inventory down for your important stuff, you know what that stuff is, what is critical for your business, what do you absolutely need to operate, at least start with that. And then you can grow it from there, right? And it doesn't have to be this exhaustive list. You can just do things like, what's the make and model? Did you get that? Did you get the serial number? What is its network address or host address if you're serial? Things like OS or firmware or both. What software is on it? You want to know these things. And then, of course, if it's got a network address and it's listening on ports, you want to know those as well. And then if it's, what its patch state is. And that doesn't mean like you need to maintain a rigorous patching program. You need to know what its patch state is, because that will lead into, vulnerabilities. So if you know that this needs to be patched and it's not patched, you'll know what your vulnerabilities are. Not that you've got to do something about it, but you could if you needed to know. And of course, the standard principle is if you don't know what you have, you don't know what you're protecting. You really have you're guessing at best when it comes to your coverage in terms of what you can protect and how to respond. So the next one is basically phasing out the fragile systems. You've got these systems in your environment, you do. They've been around and they probably still work okay. It's that thing over there that you've got caution tape around it. Don't walk by it, don't sneeze it, because if it breaks, other things break. But there are those legacy systems, those custom systems, those one-offs or completely unique systems. Those applications that were written by 3 engineers and 2 of them have left the company and retired, or they're now back as expensive contractors, or maybe one of them is dead. But we have these things in our environment. We have brittle and unreliable hardware, things that were never really designed to be in a substation, but it's in a substation, right? It's not environmentally hardened. It can't really take the conditions, or you borrowed something from IT and you're kind of using it as OT, like some desktop someone gave you and it's now being used as a server for something. Or those applications that just don't play nice with the other technology in the sandbox. They only do their thing and they don't integrate well with anything else. Those components are we have them, we know they're there. The ones that are really hard to update, right? The things that you can't update it because this other thing can't be updated or that other thing can't be updated. Those are problems. And then, of course, understand that the more you standardize your stuff, it will only lower your costs, reduce your risk, and improve uptime. It's these fragile systems that cause you to do additional work, that don't integrate well, that break too easy, that you absolutely can't patch because it's too critical, all those things. You've got to try to phase those out as much as you can. So I'm not saying rip them or replace them. I'm saying put them on some sort of end of life plan. Know when you're going to get rid of them. And then architect for defense. This is a key one. If you didn't design your network in a way that makes it easy to defend, it is harder to defend. I know that sounds silly, but it's true. Minimum, you should at least have a firewall between your IT and your OT environments. Reality is almost all of the attacks come from the IT side, like almost all, if not all of the documented attacks have come from the IT side over to the OT side. So at a minimum, you got to have that. That's kind of par for the course. You really should be this tall to ride the infrastructure ride at this point. Now, if you can, you want to introduce things that are specific points for detection and visibility. I always think of like the fortress model, where it's usually got a long plane in front of it so you can see the attackers coming. There's maybe a moat and there's multiple walls and a drawbridge and a gate, all these things to make it harder for the attacker to get through the different layers and easier for you to see them coming and do something about it, right? So you want network boundaries. Try to segment your network and more than just IT/OT. You want something, if you can get more than that, know what your critical systems are. And then, of course, things like administrative and engineering systems. You need to know what your important stuff is, and you need to know how you're going to defend those. So when you design it, not just for operations, and you're not designing it just for security, you're designing it so that you can actively defend it, right? So that you know how to defend these certain things. And I'll talk about the things that are probably your biggest weaknesses or dependencies on outside systems. And we're creating more of these as we introduce more and more connections from OT into IT and IT into OT. We have more digital systems, and these digital systems, we used to have analog stuff, a lot of electromechanical stuff. Now, as it goes digital, it creates data. That data is useful in a lot of ways. So we want that data to be used outside the OT space in a lot of cases. That creates a lot more connections. It creates a lot more dependencies. The Colonial attack is a good example of an IT attack that just had process dependencies, not like, process controls or instrumentation dependencies, but just standard business process dependencies on the OT side. Those connections had forced them to shut down their OT as a result of something in IT. And then, of course, this new concept of what we're calling intelligent islanding. These are some of the more esoteric names for it. Things like share away networks. In the event that you're under attack, could you really intelligently island off your system? And I like Mark Bristow from ICS Cert's got a good name for it. He calls it turtle mode. And that's basically, if there's a problem, the turtle can bring its arms and legs in the shell, lock down the shell, and wait until the problem goes away, and then open back up and do whatever you need to do. So designing your system like that is key at this point. I realize this goes against what is happening in a lot of situations. We're integrating more systems together. I've seen a lot of organizations, municipalities even, that if they've got like a transportation system or a gas system or a water system, they're using a single control system and they're dividing it up in multiple ways. So asking you to separate those systems and island them off is a big ask, but that is by far the most effective defense we've seen from a network perspective. And it may even at some point be coming to a regulation or an executive order or a national security memorandum near you. So the next one is remote access. This one has gotten so much press. Various forms of remote access have caused everything from Oldsmar to Ukraine, you name it. There's lots of publicly documented problems with just poorly configured remote access. First thing, is anything directly connected to the internet? I mean, if so, don't. Just don't. It's a bad idea in a lot of reasons. I understand you're short-staffed. You've got a lot of problems with availability. This one is likely your absolute biggest vector into your environment. Is just allowing that right there. If you have to have it, right? If you have to do remote administration, you have to have some kind of vendor support. If that is your only option and you can't have someone, get in a truck and show up at the control center, then consider doing something like a separate environment, like a jump host, something that's outside of your control environment where they drop in there first. Your best environment, obviously, is you come in over a VPN. It's got multi-factor authentication, and then you use that to get into the VPN. Then you're allowed onto a jump host. That jump host is the only machine allowed into the control center space, and it's a different set of credentials, right? Using a different login to get to the other side of that firewall to get into the OT space. That can keep a lot of the attacks out. I mean, honestly, it would keep like 90+% out of them out. You'd have to have a very determined adversary. And then, of course, if you're allowing it, you want to monitor it. You want to know anytime someone is using that connection, you want to be able to alert on things that are, out of bounds. Like if someone does it after working hours, someone should know about that, right? Someone should at least get a notice, an email that says, hey, someone's using the remote access right now, just so you know, you want to know these things. You got to know your risks. Restricting access. So not just remote access, but restricting access. And, it's 2021. I know we have a lot of older control systems out there, but we do need to do things like change our default passwords, change our default accounts. If you've still got admin, or no password, honestly, shame on you. Those days are over. Things are too connected now. They'll find a way in, and the first thing they look for is the default passwords. These manuals are out there. They're in every language. So don't think that just because your system is old and unique, there's a manual. And if not, there's Google Translate. So they can basically take anything, find out what the default manufacturer passwords are. And there's lists out there that exist all over the internet. That's the first place to go, right? That's a given. So change the defaults. If you can, you want to use unique accounts. You don't want to use shared accounts. I understand shared accounts may be easier. If you have to use shared accounts, you want to track who's got access. You want to know who's got access to the shared accounts. If someone leaves, you want to change the account, change the password at least, right? So that, whoever left doesn't still have access. Principle of least privilege is a fancy way of saying, don't let everyone be administrator, right? Have a user level of access and have an administrator level of access, maybe even some layers in between, like engineers that maybe need a little bit more administrative access, but not full on administrator. So basically only give them the privilege that they need to do their job. That is the principle of least privilege. And if you do things like, oh, there's a new person, just model them after Alice or Bob, and then they just, grant that. There's often a chain of privileges that person has gained over time, and you want to make sure you check that and don't just model after in every case. You want to create a new one and only give them what they need. That is by far the best approach. Not many administrators or groups of administrators. You want to have the fewest amount of people with that kind of access. Not everyone needs like local administrator on their machine to run standard software. It just, most software is not written that way anymore. That's an old story, and we're getting past that now. If you can, you want different credentials, like different logins for your account on the IT side of the network, and your account on the OT side should be different accounts. You don't want them to be the exact same, because obviously if someone somehow hacks the IT side, then they have access to the same stuff on the OT side. Yes, it's a bit more challenging because you have to have different accounts and you have to remember maybe 2 passwords. Or more, but that is still going to be the best approach, especially when you're talking about protecting your important stuff, And then remove access as soon as someone doesn't need it. You want to remove that access. Disabling access is one of the big ones. When they're terminated or when they change job roles, you want to remove that access, because that is often what's discovered is someone just left that access open, or they come back and they still have it, or they've used that same account and password on some other website that got hacked, and then it gets reused in here, or it's left there. So one of the tricks for passwords to make it a little bit easier for you is to use long passwords, not complex passwords. You don't need uppercase, lowercase, punctuation, special characters, Egyptian hieroglyphics and alien letters. You really just need something long. So you can make a long sentence. That's fine. And it can be all lowercase if you want, but just the main thing is have something you can remember. Just make it, because a long sentence is actually easier for you to remember than something complex. It's also easier for you to type. So that's actually a much better approach. It has what they call more password entropy in length than there is in complexity. Make it easier for yourself. The next one is vulnerability management. So you want to manage your vulnerabilities. I'm not saying you want to use things like a vulnerability scanner. We'll talk about that, but you want to know where you're vulnerable. And that is because if you do need to segment, if you do need to do something, knowing your vulnerabilities is half the battle. Not knowing means, honestly, you're guessing. And you don't want to guess when it comes to security, especially security of your critical stuff. So take the guessing out and at least know what your vulnerabilities are. Now, in a lot of cases, there are things that are called insecure by design. These are systems that are going to be vulnerable always because of the way they're designed. They're not designed to be secured in an effective way. Things that will, for example, accept firmware without authentication. Like you can just push in a new firmware and it'll work. It'll just take it. There's lots of other similar situations where they're just not really easy to secure or not securable. And there are ways to secure those as you put protections around them, or you put them in a special network segment, or you look for things like anything other than just the known commands to that system through something like an intrusion detection system or other kinds of logging. But a lot of vendors do things like they want to be first to market with some new feature. So they end up making that feature basically as fast as they can. And it's really coded too fast and it ends up being vulnerable. And I want to make it at least a nod to the difference between vulnerabilities and patching. So a vulnerability is something that is wrong with the system. And it can be things like insecure by design. It just uses an older protocol, or it will accept firmware, as I mentioned. It's just designed in a way that really can't be secured well or can't be secured. Patching is, well, there's a software patch for that, or there's a firmware patch for that. There's a way to fix it, right? So you can have situations where patch and vulnerability have drift between them, right? There isn't going to be a one-to-one match every time. And you end up with things what are called 0 days. For those that don't know, 0 days basically there is a vulnerability in the system, and the only person that knows about it is the attacker or the criminal. And then they use it and it gets discovered. And the day that it gets discovered, basically it's called a 0 day, because that is day 0 of public knowledge of that vulnerability. The other side of that are what are called forever days, right? Those are the vulnerabilities that we know about, the vendor knows about, everyone knows about, but the vendor is not going to do anything about it. It's just going to be vulnerable forever. And in some cases, these are like end of life products, or the vendor just basically says, yeah, I don't think that's a big enough problem for me to dedicate time to fix it. We don't have enough, we're not selling enough of that anymore, or various different reasons. You end up with what's called forever days. So if you have to patch, and you should patch where you can, you shouldn't ignore it, but you should at least know what you need to patch first. So prioritize your systems in terms of, if there is some sort of, oh my God, we need to patch this because we are definitely vulnerable to this and it would cause massive problems if someone did exploit it. And I understand that it's a system and it would take someone, certain hops to get into where you are. But again, you are a target, whether it's automated scanning that finds you or a determined adversary that says, hey, you're adjacent to big company X. You have to factor that in. You don't want to assume it's not going to happen. So given that assumption, if you have to patch, what do you patch first? Typically, you want to start at your perimeter because that's where they come in. They come in through the IT side or the things at the perimeter first, and then kind of work your way inward if you're doing kind of a patching program. If you've got particularly high-risk systems, those should be patched first as well. And I understand that applying the patch may, cause an outage as well. So planning for this is key. If you've got a test system, at least test it somehow, some way. Talk to the vendor. There's lots of ways to get more assurance than no assurance, and doing nothing is basically just opening the door, right? There are some tools like vulnerability scanners that can do this. I don't necessarily recommend them unless you're using them in a test environment. Vulnerability scanners have been known to take control systems offline, especially older legacy control systems. Much of the modern stuff can take vulnerability scanning, but honestly, you don't want to find out you've got that widget that is a big problem if it goes down, and it goes down because you scanned it with one of the vulnerability scanners. There are other ways. That's called an active scan. There are ways to do this passively, which is basically looking at configurations, pulling firmware, looking at versions of services, and just doing kind of what's called a passive vulnerability scan, which means you're really just looking up on vulnerability databases and vendor websites, is my configuration or is my version or revision of software or patch vulnerable. And as I mentioned, firmware accounts too. You'd be surprised how many vulnerabilities, QNX, VXWorks, these things get bundled inside your firmware. And just because it's firmware doesn't mean it's secure. That is a very big myth. Same thing with serial. Just because it's serial, honestly, doesn't mean it's secure. Protocols are protocols, and firmware is just another type of in theory, etched in software. But in reality, we've seen, I can count on at least fingers and toes how many vulnerabilities we've seen lately in packages inside firmware. So there are ways to look this up. You can use a lot of these software bill of materials tool sets out there, like SBOM tools. I think Adolis has a free one that you can use, and you can send it a copy of your firmware, and it'll spit out a result that says, hey, there's a piece of this in your firmware that's vulnerable. It'll say, nope, we haven't seen anything here. Controlling change. This is a big one. And this can be hard to do, but it can be free. I mean, other than time, right? It doesn't cost a lot. Again, don't have to do this for everything. You can do this for just your critical systems or your most important ones. And honestly, it is your best defense against accidents and malice, right? So whether it's a bad actor intentionally changing the system, or it's, someone making a change either accidentally or on purpose, this will help you know what happened, because almost always these systems, unless there's a hardware failure or someone exploited a vulnerability, which is pretty rare, things go down because someone changed something. That is 90% or more of the issue. So just knowing what its state was can help you know that something changed, and it can help you revert back to what was a known good state, because you knew what the state was before the change was made. So change control is absolutely one of the next steps into maturity for a lot of organizations. Is, you're not, reactive putting out fires. You're actually thinking about the change before you make it. You're going through something that looks like a change control or change review board. And this doesn't have to be fancy and, cumbersome and a big process with a bunch of fanfare. It can literally be who supports these systems, thinking about it and saying, okay, what's that going to impact? And bring in some people that support the systems that are adjacent to it or that feed it or get the output from it and say, is this going to impact you? And just have that conversation. And it can often be a quick conversation and everyone says, nope, that's no problem. Let's move forward. Or someone says, let's at least test this thing first before we make the full change, and we'll figure out if we've got a plan to back it out, that kind of thing. So it helps you manage your environment, knowing what your state is, knowing where you went, knowing you can back out if you had to. That's absolutely imperative, because the main thing is, if you don't know what you have, you don't know how it's changing, it's exceedingly difficult to manage it. I mean, you really are just in a pure reactionary firefighting mode, and anyone can do anything, and there's just no management, no measurement. So the next one is logging and monitoring, and you hear a lot of this lately for a lot of good reasons. Most of the systems that we have out there now will log. They'll log something, right? And you can often get the data out of that device. So don't turn on all logging immediately, because you'll basically get swamped in data, and you might even choke some of your connections. But go and look and see what the logging options are, and turn on at least some of the key ones, like who's logging in and when, right? You want to see like failed login attempts, so you can see if someone's trying to log in a bunch of times and failing. You want to see when someone got in. So if an administrator got in, but it happened at 3 a.m. over a VPN, and the VPN connection was from, Malaysia, you want to know about that, right? That's something that's very uncommon. So being able to trace that back and see what happened is key. So there's the logging piece is first, are you logging it? Will the device even log it? And then monitoring is the next part. So creating the logs, getting them somewhere that you can actually monitor them. And these are, everything from, there's network monitoring, so what the network is doing, the network devices, the traffic across the network, and there's even system monitoring, so will the devices themselves create the logs and send them as well. So there's really two different kinds. And there's the security incident and event management platforms, or SIEM, SIEM tools. There's a lot of these out there. There are some free ones. There are some expensive ones. Either way, it's probably your best approach for kind of aggregating or escrowing all of the logs from all these different environments. It's designed for that, right? It was purpose built for that in mind. The hard part about them is getting everything tuned. So maybe you push all the data in there, and then you're looking at what, 1 million false positives. So it takes a bit of time to tune it so that it's only generating alerts on things that are real, because a lot of these systems generate errors for things that are just innocuous. But once you know that, then you can say, okay, that's a false positive. Don't show me that anymore. The problem is if it gets too noisy, you say that for everything, and you end up really monitoring nothing because you've tuned everything out. So be careful with that balance. And then of course you want to look at these SIM tools that, don't just pick one because it's cheap. Pick one because it will first do what you're looking for. It will help you save time, and that it also works well with your other technologies that you want to feed into it. Those are key pieces, because with free, you might end up with something that's free like a puppy. And there are OT specific tools, right? So you don't have to use an IT tool for this. There are tools that are really designed just for OT. There are tools that are designed for both OT and IT, so you can get an enterprise perspective, which is actually the best approach, because most of the time, the attacks, as I mentioned, come from IT into OT, and this would help you see it coming from that direction. And then, of course, there are tools like Neighborhood Keeper, and I'm sure that Carter will talk about Neighborhood Keeper as well. There are some tools that are purpose-built for just the munis. It's designed with you in mind. The next one is keep it simple. And I know this sounds kind of redundant or expected, but I can't stress it enough. Don't overbuy the security technologies. You don't need every security widget out there. You're going to end up with a bunch of blinky lights that are doing nothing more than being a space heater in some data center or under someone's desk. You really don't want to do that. So start out with a very careful, thoughtful approach in mind. First, start with something that's going to help you get your logging under control, because you got to log first, right? That's the first piece. Then you're going to get your monitoring and your visibility. After that, you will need things like, of course, you should have some antivirus. It's not perfect, no, but you still need it, unfortunately. If you can do things like application whitelisting. But in reality, honestly, even a simple SIM tool used well will give you as much coverage as most other things, because it shows you what the anomalies are, right? But the key component is don't just buy it. You got to configure it, and you got to configure it right, which means train your staff. They need to know how to use the tool. So if I've got some insanely powerful, power tool and I've never used it before, I'm likely going to chop off my fingers if I'm not trained on how to use it. And we're big on safety in our world. It's the same thing. You need training in this area. So we'll talk about some training as well coming up. But the main thing is you want to watch out for complexity. If you buy a bunch of security tools and turn them all on and think that's going to make you secure, you're absolutely wrong, and you wasted your money, wasted your time. So reduce the technology. You want to reduce the technology diversity. So not just the security tools, but you don't want to have like 15 flavors of Cisco devices in your organization. You don't want to have, a bunch of different Linux environments if you can minimize it, or a bunch of different Windows environments. You want to try to reduce that, what I call technology blueprint or footprint on both software and hardware, because it helps you have to protect fewer things. Each new thing is a new thing that you've got to protect in a different way. So minimize that, right? Get as much of this standardized. You want to get rid of as many snowflakes and unique things out there as you possibly can. It also reduces the attack surface because you're not having to look at all of the different services and things for that and that and that and that. It's just for these things as much as you can. Volume purchases and easier on supply chain risk. These are all things that are just additional benefits on simplifying not only your security technologies, but your entire operational technology, overall technology blueprint, footprint, solution suites. And then response and recovery. This is the last one. So you've done everything else and they still got through. Ransomware does this a lot, right? Because humans are humans and they're not trying to be malicious or not. They're not lazy. They're not bad people. It's that the attackers are really good at convincing people to click on things, in addition to our natural tendency to want to help and want to click on things. So it's a difficult battle to fight. So you're going to need to be prepared for this. And if you think it's never going to happen to you, it's really not an if, it's a when. So honestly, really, I can't stress this enough. You've got to have a plan. If your first time thinking about an incident response plan is after the incident is happening, you're going to be in a world of hurt. And it's likely going to be a much, much bigger problem than it should have been. So start out with an incident response plan. And this doesn't have to be a big, 2-inch thick incident response plan from NIST. This can be a 2-pager. It can be simple. Write down something you will use, but have a plan. It's got to be something you can actually follow. There are a lot of really good resources in the Muni space. There is the Public Power Incident Response Playbook. It's excellent. I've seen it. You can do things like paper or tabletop exercises. Do these a lot, right? You really do need to practice like it's game day. If you've never practiced it and it's an incident, too bad, too late. It's not going to help. It's going to help minimally, right? It's not going to have nearly as much benefit as if you've actually practiced it. The NERC GridX exercise is actually really good. And it goes through some really extreme scenarios. I think the next one's probably going to have like alien invasions or, I don't know, creatures coming out of the sea, because they factor in almost everything so far in terms of the possible attack surface. You've got this awesome thing called cyber mutual assistance in your space, in the Muni space. It's wonderful. There is what's called ICS for ICS, and it's the Incident Command Structure for Industrial Control Systems. It's fairly new. It's getting a little bit of traction. It's got some good structure and rigor, and it gives you access to some federal resources and some other things as well. You can mix and match these things. You don't have to pick one. And I recommend, I hate to say it, all of them, because realistically, all of the prevention still will not stop a determined adversary. You're going to need to be reactive at some point, and you should be good at being reactive. Your incident responders should be able to respond just like your linemen if there's an outage. They jump in the truck, they know exactly what to do, they know exactly what equipment they need. There's a list, there's work orders ready to go. Everything is cleared in terms of things like weight limits on state lines. I mean, everything like that, think about it and make sure it's all prepared and ready to go. Because in the event that you need to take your incident and perform incident response, there's a possibility that it's going to go beyond your capability into a recovery state where you're going to have to recover something. Ransomware is a good example. I mean, by that time, it's encrypted the systems, and no one recommends payment. It's a bad idea. You're funding terrorism. All these other arguments about it. Spend your money on getting good at response and good at recovery instead, so that you got ransomware. Okay, isolate, recover, move on. But have you actually tried to recover. That's the big thing. A lot of people say they can, or they can operate manually. I hear that one a lot. How long? I mean, a couple of days, weeks. You definitely can't do months. You're going to do like manual telemetry on cell phones, especially if there's a disaster. I mean, it's not feasible anymore. So having something that's well-oiled, good to go, all the way to the recovery stage of testing your recovery as well, not just your response to minimize the incident, but to recover from it. Actually try it, actually do it. And again, these are things that are basically free. I mean, this is just your time, right? And as much as it will save you time in the long run, I would spend as much time as you can on it now, because it'll save untold hours and untold dollars in the future. So some bonus pieces in addition to the 10 that I talked about, the top 10 list. Regulation always has to come into the discussion. Compliance doesn't equal security. In no way, shape, or form is compliance equal to security. Compliance is a minimum. It's the floor. It's not the ceiling. It's the, you must be this tall to ride the ride, is the compliance piece. It's always, legislation, regulations always slower than attackers and hackers. They will move much faster than regulation. It's never going to keep pace. So just expect that, right? Don't ever say that because you were compliant, you were secure. And one of the key pieces is compliance and regulation. They prescribe an action. They tell you this, you must do this. They don't help the attitude problem. They don't make you want to do it or entice you to want to do it. So doing this because you want to do it because it's good for business and because it'll minimize your downtime and because it'll actually save you money are much better reasons than just because you were forced to by law. But there's other things that can influence your world, what I call transient regulation, which is basically regulation that isn't necessarily applicable to you. You may or may not have NERC-CIP in your world. You may be under the threshold. If so, great. Doesn't mean it's a bad idea. It's actually got some fairly good stuff in there. It's not perfect. God, by no means is it perfect. It's got warts and many other things, but it's still designed for, it was written by our industry for our industry, by utilities. So there are some good things in there that you can borrow and use. It's still kind of an expectation. So whether you're dealing with constituents or neighbors or business partners, that's kind of the expectation. Of course, things like executive orders, national security memorandums, there are things beyond NERC-CIP because that's just FERC's authority. And there are other authorities, like if it's a national security problem, DHS has authority to actually direct you to do things. That can happen, believe it or not. So just be aware of these things, pay attention to them, and at least do some things that kind of, if you're seeing some common threads in things like executive orders and NERC-CIP and national security memorandums and other industries, probably do those things that look common across the board. And we'll talk about some of those. And then of course, things like insurance. You may not be able to get cybersecurity insurance, period, unless you do some of these things that are considered kind of industry norms. And they'll just deny your claim or they'll deny your coverage. So this is not just because the regulator said to do it, but because you will not get insurance if you don't. And then of course, things like contracts, there are business partner expectations, upstream, downstream, and even peer-to-peer relationships where this is basically part of the contract, just going forward. So as I mentioned, some frameworks and metrics. Honestly, where do you start? There are so many frameworks and so many metrics. Do you need to know all of them? God, no. No, just pick one and measure to that. I don't care which one you pick. I'm Italian. I like to call it Italian food. It's basically all the same ingredients. You just mix it up a different way and you give it some new name or something else. These things basically are designed to measure your environment. So you don't really need to start with things like NERC-CIP or NIST. They're good because they're already common to the industry. So I would say at least pick one. And you don't need to do something like a big gap assessment where you hire some big firm to come in and figure out where you are. You can actually just decide on one and then design all new projects to meet that, right? So you can start folding it in over time. If you want to do an assessment, great. That's not a bad idea by any stretch. It's a fantastic idea, but it can be expensive. So if I had my recommendations, I would say probably 853 and 882 would be a good one, not because it's different than NERC-CIP, but because a lot of the NERC-CIP controls have already been mapped to this as well. So it's kind of portable back and forth. So what I've seen with in particular, the 882 is it speaks directly to control systems, and 53 speaks to IT, so you can measure both sides if you want to, and you can get a better kind of holistic picture of your entire organization, because again, they're connected, right? You don't get one without the other. It does fit within the NIST cybersecurity framework. It's actually one of the supporting components. It's a companion to the electricity subsector cybersecurity capability maturity model, or the ESC2M2, which is another really good measurement, which is pretty easy to do and free. But it's a consistent measurement you can use to demonstrate your progress, right? You don't know if all the things that you're doing are actually making a difference. And this is a way to measure it and find out and see where you mature over time as you implement these new controls. Again, there's a way to do this in bite-sized pieces over time, but the key is pick something and then move forward. Okay, the next one in the bonus slides are your people. This is the absolute most important part of all of it. I get the example is basically if you install 20 new security cameras and then no one is watching them, you wasted your money on the cameras and the infrastructure because it's just running. No one's doing anything with it. So the same thing with your security tools. If you put a security tool in, it needs to be generating a useful, meaningful alert to somebody who can do something about it. So get your people trained on the tools that you have before you buy another tool. You may be surprised that the tool you have probably good enough to do some of those things you're going to go out and buy some new tool for. And you don't need like a best of breed for everything. Good enough in a lot of cases is good enough, and it will get you a lot further just in the hands of a really skilled operator than yet another tool to do that thing with an unskilled operator of that tool. So your people are absolutely your most important part. I've seen situations where the tools have either been misconfigured or the attackers have circumvented the tools through various means. And the only way it was detected was because somebody, a human being, said, something doesn't look right. And they went and checked and they looked and they're like, yeah, that's not right. And they keep digging. So your humans, you know, they have intrusion detection systems and intrusion prevention systems and application whitelisting and all these things. Honestly, you need an aware person system. That is your best thing you can possibly have. So how do you get these people? Well, security awareness and training, yes, do that. And find unique and creative ways to keep it entertaining. There's lots of different options out there now. It's getting better and better over time. But most importantly, break down your HR barriers. How you hire your security people is fundamentally broken in almost all organizations, especially in municipalities that I've seen. You need entry-level security talent. They're less expensive. Spend the money on training them. And that's okay if you train them and they leave, because it's better to train them up and have them leave versus never train them and have them stay. You want to actually become a training mill for these kinds of things, because then people will want to come to your organization to get the training, to work for you and get the experience, because they'll be dedicated in addition to the public service component that comes with it. So be that training path, be okay with them leaving, be able to hire basically entry-level talent and give the people that are already doing that job, don't make this an other duties as assigned without additional time. So if you give your senior security people no time to help train the newbies, that's just going to burden them. They're going to get burned out and they're going to leave. You don't want that. Give them the time to help these people, train them, grow them, and work with that as your new approach. And definitely encourage things like conferences, networking. They will learn more from their peers and the human connections than they will from sitting and watching a PowerPoint slide or a conference deck somewhere. That human interaction is going to be so much more valuable in every single case. So encourage them to do things like events, pay for that if you can. Find ways to get them out and into the community. Host the events if you need to, bring them to you. That can often be even cheaper. So find ways to get that human connection made as well. So last, summary. This is the top 10. At least do these things. You don't have to nail them out of the gate. Just start working on these things and start making progress. Measure your progress on these things so you'll know if you're actually getting benefit out of it, if what you're doing is working. Asset inventory, phase out fragile systems, build a network you can actually defend, lock down all remote access, restrict the users to only what they need to do and only that. And then manage vulnerabilities and patches, at least know about them so you can manage them if you need to. Change control and configuration management. Know what the system state is, know how to go back to that state if something changed, whether malicious or accidental. Monitor as much as you can, log as much as you can. Again, doesn't have to be everything, but just start with some things and then move it, grow it from there. Simplify, simplify, simplify. You probably need fewer security tools and more skilled people. And less complexity in your overall environment is going to benefit you in so many ways. And then practice, 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 practice incident response and recovery. It'll help you so much. With that, my information is right here. please feel free to contact me anytime whatsoever. And thanks so much for having me.